Good evening to all of you all listening in. Welcome to Monday Night Philosophy, brought to you by the Atlas Society, the home of open objectivism. I'm William R. Thomas, the Director of Programs here at the Atlas Society. Tonight's webinar kicks off a new 5-part series by my colleague Alexander R. Cohen entitled Objectivism, a Rational Philosophy for the Hero in Your Soul. The course begins tonight with Session 1, Living for Yourself. And each one of these sessions builds on the others to take you through the key ideas of objectivism in epistemology, ethics, politics, and aesthetics. Oh, and by the way, once you register once for one of these sessions, you will remain registered for all of them. So the same login will work for you every time if you keep coming back. And we come back next Monday, April 29th, with the next in the series, focusing on reality. And then on May 6th, Alexander will be presenting values and virtues. And on May 13th, we'll move to the political with individual rights. And the final session is Monday, May 20th, where spiritual fuel is the topic, the role of art in life. This is a course I really hope will inspire all of you. Alexander R. Cohen intends to, in each of these sessions, to give you an exciting and thoughtful and practical introduction, not only to what objectivism is as a philosophical system, but what it means and why it matters. This first session concerns why you should value your own life as the ultimate value for you. And that's the key to a heroic attitude towards yourself. Now, Alexander R. Cohen, the instructor for the course, is a colleague of mine. He's the managing editor of the Atlas Society's Business Rights Center and an associate scholar here at the Atlas Society. You can read his blog and other articles written on business rights on our website. And he's very learned. He's earned a bachelor's degree in broadcast journalism at American University. He has a law degree from the University of Pennsylvania, and then went on to do graduate work in philosophy, beginning at the City University of New York, and then in the PhD program at the University of Virginia. And he's also studied at the Atlas Society Graduate Seminar, where he was also an instructor. So, without further ado, I give you Alexander Cohen on Living for Yourself. Take it away, Alexander.
Imagine you could be free from all the unchosen duties people claim you owe to others, from duties to your parents or relatives, to your neighbors or passers-by, to your country or government, and even to God's. Imagine there was no one you had to obey, nothing you had to do. Imagine a world in which the only things you do are the things you want to do, and you do them because you see the value in them. For centuries, said Ayn Rand in Atlas Shrugged, the battle of morality was fought between those who claimed that your life belongs to God and those who claimed that it belongs to your neighbors, between those who preached that the good is self-sacrifice for the sake of ghosts in heaven, and those who preached that the good is self-sacrifice for the sake of incompetence on earth. And no one came to say that your life belongs to you and that the good is to live it. That is what Ayn Rand said. That is what I say. That is what objectivism says. Your life belongs to you, and the good is to live it. Whatever you do, whatever goals you seek, objectivism says you should choose them, and you should choose them because of how they contribute to your life. This includes the work by which you support your life, and the things you do for fun. It also includes your relationships, business relationships, friendships, romances, even relationships with parents and children. Whatever relationships you enter, whatever relationships you stay in, whatever work you put into those relationships, you don't have to have them. They are not burdens you must carry, whether they are good for you or bad. It is only good to enter them, be in them, and invest in them, if you do so for your own good. Even the value of politics needs to be grounded in your life. Or it's not worth being political. Objectivism supports a free society because in a free society, you can pursue your own good and I can pursue mine. And your decision to work toward a free society, if you choose to do so, should be based on what that decision offers you. Both how your life would be better if you made your society freer, and how your life is enriched by working in that cause. You don't have a duty to work for my freedom. The question is, why is it valuable for you? Because objectivism holds that your life belongs to you and the good is to live it, the purpose of the objectivist ethics is to help you live. The whole objectivist ethical system, which we'll discuss in Webinar 3, is a set of mental tools for surviving, flourishing, and being happy. That's what the objectivist ethics sets out to offer. But why should you take that offer? If you came in here with a different ethical view, one that opposes selfishness, why should you discard that and become an objectivist? Well, to identify the best of any kind of thing, you need to know what the purpose of that kind of thing is. For example, suppose you were asked, which is better, a sharp sword or a dull one? Presumably, you would say, the sharp one. But suppose you were asked, which is the best fencing for it? In that case, the answer would be the dull one. Why is sharp better in one case and dull better in the other? Because the purpose of a sword is to cut, so it's better if it's sharp. But the purpose of a foil is to poke people as part of a sport without injuring them, so it's better if it's dull. For any kind of man-made object, including swords and fencing foils, the one best suited to its purpose is the best one. So if we want to know what the best ethical system is, we have to start by asking, what is an ethical system? What is its purpose? An ethical system is a code of values, an organized set of goals. More than that, it's a body of knowledge, or alleged knowledge, about what values are worth pursuing for a human being. So why do we need such knowledge? And what is its purpose? One of the most important facts about human beings is that we make decisions. When we make a decision, we have multiple options. There are multiple things that we could decide to do. And we don't have automatic standards by which to make those decisions. We don't automatically know what sorts of actions will have what results, and what sort of results are worth pursuing or avoiding. And yet, our decisions have substantial effects. They can lead to survival or death, pleasure or pain, love or loneliness, and so forth, for ourselves and for others. If we know which of the actions open to us will lead to what effects, then we can choose the effects, or try to choose the effects, by choosing our actions. And if we know what values we are trying to achieve, then we can choose the actions and effects that contribute to achieving those values. I've used the term value, but I haven't explained it, so let me do so now. A value is that which one acts to gain and or keep. That means that calling something a value only makes sense in the context of a valuer, someone who acts to gain and or keep it. That's what we mean when we say that value is relational. A value is a value to someone who values it. And if there's a reason to value something, it has to be for some purpose. If I act to gain a new computer, for example, it's for the purpose of using it. Notice that this purpose is itself a value. If I value the computer for the purpose of using the computer, that means I value using the computer. When I act to gain and keep a computer, it's part of acting to gain the activity of using the computer. for example, for the preparation of webinars. That sets up a chain of values. The value of the computer depends on the value of using it, for example, to create webinars. But what makes a webinar a value to me? And what makes that a value? We could go on asking this sort of question seemingly infinitely. But if every time I say I value something for some purpose, I need to say why I value that purpose, then I seem to be valuing things for no reason. Each link of the chain may hang neatly on the one before, but unless there's something solid on which everything else can hang, everything hangs on nothing. It takes a very special kind of value to anchor that chain, your own life. Your life is a value that consists of actions, at least some of which have the purpose of gaining and keeping your own life. You act to pursue the value of your life, and then, having your life, you use it acting to pursue the value of your life. Indeed, living means acting, at least to some extent, in order to keep living. And all of your actions are part of your life. Acting to gain or keep a value implies a possibility of not gaining or keeping it. In the case of life, not keeping it means dying. It is because you face this constant alternative, because if you fail to preserve your life and no one else steps in, you die, that we can say things are good or bad for you. They promote or endanger your existence. So why should you adopt the objectivist ethics? One might answer, because it's an ethics based on the value of life that tells you how to pursue and achieve that value. And indeed, that is the basis and goal of the objectivist ethics. But wait! What is that should? What does it mean? There is no basis to say you should or must do something except in order to achieve some value. And the argument has shown how your life can anchor your chain of values if you value life. But it has not shown that you must value life. Indeed, because the argument proposes valuing life for its own sake and not as a means to some other value, it cannot say that you must value your life. There's nothing for that must to hang on. Not only that, but if there were something in the argument that said you had to value your life, objectivism would not fulfill the promise I made a few minutes ago, to free you from having to do things. You'd have to live, and you'd have to do all the things you need to do in order to live. If you are going to have the radical freedom that objectivism promises, life must be a choice. So if the objectivist morality hangs on the choice to live, why should you make that choice? You might be surprised that I even have something to say about that. After all, I've just told you that I can't give you an argument that says you must choose to live. Indeed, if you can't value anything without valuing your life, it seems there's no case to be made. What can I appeal to if you don't already value your life? I can't say, for example, you should value your life in order to work, because you can't value your work without valuing your life. It's a circle. I can't say you should value your life for the sake of your friendships, because you can't value your friendships without valuing your life. Another circle. And the same applies if I bring in any other value. I could bring in art, I could bring in food, I could bring in anything but it would still be a circle. Even if I were to say, the cause of liberty. Well, what's the use of liberty if you don't want to live? The solution to this predicament is this. You have to look from within the circle. If there are activities you enjoy, those are parts of your life that you do value. And because you can only have those values, or any other values if you live, you have reason to value your life. Yes, if you stopped valuing your life, all those other values would go away too. But if you do value your life, even parts of it, even a little bit, you can look at your life and see what you love in it. And this is an exercise that's worth doing from time to time when you're not seriously considering dying. Ask yourself what you're living for, what aspects of life you really value. And then you can ask yourself how you can pursue more of the values that make your life worth living. It's a question worth asking too, all the more worth asking indeed, when that question, should I live, really grips you. If you do choose to live, then values are possible. You can value things because they contribute to your life. And because you are living, and as part of living, you can act to gain and keep your life and your other values. And if you choose to live, some values are required. They're required in the sense that you need them in order to live. Thus, the purpose of a code of ethics is not just to guide your actions for any random purpose or by any random standard, but to identify the values you need in order to live. Ayn Rand's greatest achievement in ethics was making that explicit and basing her system on taking human life as your standard and your own life as your purpose. That's why she called her ethical system the morality of life. Because man has a specific nature, because there are certain values that a human being needs to achieve if he is going to live, there are moral principles that apply to every one of us, principles that tell us how to live as a human being. A human being has the ability to think and has the need to think if he is going to live as a human being, or indeed if he is going to live at all, because he only can live as a human being. And thus, one of the virtues, indeed the primary virtue, is the virtue of rationality, the virtue of living by reason. A human being needs to choose on the basis of his thought, needs to create values if he's going to live, the values that sustain his life. And thus, productiveness is one of the virtues. There are a fair few virtues, greater and smaller, and we will discuss those in more detail in Lecture 3. Each of them relates to the nature of a human being and what he needs to do in order to live. And thus, according to Objectivism, the standard of morality, as distinguished from its purpose, is the life of man qua man, that is, what the life of a human being requires, what a human being needs to do in order to live. At the core of this standard is survival, that is, continuing to exist. But there's more to a human life than that. There's living as a human being, that is, living by the methods of a human being. That means practicing the virtues. But what are the virtues? Well, they're not just anything that people or traditions may call virtues. Virtues are the ways of acting that tend towards survival, the character traits and principles of action by which you can achieve the values that sustain your life. As I mentioned, foremost among these is rationality. Now, Ayn Rand does not use the word flourishing, but she does speak of living a life proper to a rational being. I interpret that as flourishing. The interpretation of flourishing that I'm using in this lecture series is one I have worked on over the years. I think of flourishing and survival as dimensions of life. Living longer and living better, living for more time and living more like a human being, are both ways of having more life. They are both ways of doing more of the actions that sustain yourself as a human, as a rational being. They are both ways of making sure that your life is more, has more life in it. But while the objectivist morality identifies some values as important for every human being, it's important to remember that the reason that it does this is to identify the values each human being needs to pursue for himself or for herself. These values are universal in the sense that for each and every individual, pursuing and achieving these values will help that person live. But that does not mean that if you choose to live, you need to pursue these values for everyone. Quite the contrary. It means that each and every individual, if he wishes to live, needs to make his own life his guiding value. When we discuss values and virtues at more length in Webinar 3 and Friendship in Webinar 5, we'll see that living for yourself often gives you reasons to help others. But the justification for that will still be grounded in your life. And that means rejecting the notion that morality is about doing good for others, be it all of humanity, or your family, or tribe, or society, or whoever else. If you make any other person or any group your goal, you are bleeding off the resources that you need in order to sustain your life. And as I mentioned, there are proper ways to invest in relationships with others. But that's not bleeding off the resources that you need to sustain your life. That is putting them to use by means of developing those relationships that then work out to your benefit as well as the other person's. We experience physical pleasure and pain automatically. They reflect what's going on in our bodies, what evolution says is good or bad for us. But while emotional pleasure and pain are also automatic, they are based on a standard held subconsciously. On the basis of that subconscious standard, your emotions deliver an instantaneous report on whether things are going well or badly for you. They respond to what you take to be your long-range interests, to the well-being of other persons and institutions that you value. They respond to evidence about whether you live in a world that suits you, whether you are the kind of person who can handle the world in which you live. Thus, for example, You might feel glad or relieved if your country defeats an enemy, but just the opposite if that enemy defeats your country. You might feel a certain sort of pleasure at a news event that reaffirms your sense of how the world works, or that shows things happening that tend to your benefit in some way, or that shows a human potential that you aspire to embody yourself. And, on the other hand, you might feel very badly if an enemy defeats your country, especially if it conquers your country. You might feel a negative emotion at any depiction of a world that you would take as bad for you, as the kind of world that you couldn't handle or wouldn't want to handle. If you think disasters are natural and permanent, if you see yourself as helpless, you might be ground down by a misfortune, unable to continue. But if you see yourself as competent, you might take that same misfortune as a challenge and as an occasion for resolve or even for excitement. Rand called your subconscious view of man and of reality your sense of life. Now, what you take to be good or bad for you depends on your values. So since emotions depend on what you take to be good for you or bad, your emotions are governed by your values. That's why your emotions cannot serve as a standard of value. That would be saying, value whatever you value. Moreover, you cannot monitor your emotional processes because they are subconscious in the same way that you can monitor your cognitive processes, your conscious processes. And we'll talk more about that in Lecture 2. Joy is an emotional response to the achievement of values, the feeling you get when you get something that you subconsciously assess as a value. But sometimes you both get a value and defeat your values at the same time. Then you might experience a clouded or contradictory joy. For example, suppose you know that you need to get a project done very soon and you stop to eat a meal. The meal is a value. You might enjoy it, but at the same time, you'll have a bad feeling nagging at you because you're diverting time to the meal that you need to spend on your work. Or if you spend too much money on the meal, you can't really afford it. You might enjoy the sensual pleasures of a delicious and expensive meal, but at the same time, you'll have that guilt nagging at you from the harm you're doing to your long-range values by giving up more money than you can really afford on that meal. Happiness isn't like that. Happiness is defined as a state of non-contradictory joy, the subconscious assessment that you are achieving your values and not working against them. If you are living by the virtues that promote your life, then you are not acting in ways that destroy your values. Instead, you are acting in ways that promote your life, ways that contribute to the achievement of your values. And you are developing and reinforcing the habits that make you a person who promotes your own life, thus securing your values in the long run. It is, of course, impossible to pursue one value without destroying another if your values conflict. That's an additional reason to have a clear, rational code of values so that your values do not conflict, or if specific values do, so that you can choose and so that you can know that by your choice you are pursuing your highest values. So, for example, if an important professional event and your cousin's wedding happen to be on the same day on opposite sides of the country, as once happened to me, you can say, well, what are the important values in my life? Oh, my career is very important. It's what I sustain my life by. My career happens to involve my moral code of values, and that, of course, is a pervasive and fundamental value. My cousin is not especially close, and a ceremony is a ceremony, and she'll continue to be around, and I can visit her and her husband's home later. So the clear thing to do is attend the professional event, and then, even if I'm aware that there's this other value that I could be pursuing that I'm missing out on, it doesn't bother me that much because I know that I am pursuing my higher values. And it's impossible to achieve your values if they conflict with reality. If they are impossible, or if they call for you to act in ways that, given the facts, destroy your values. So you need a code of values that is attuned to the facts of human nature and of the world in which we live. And it's impossible to achieve your values if you are not aware of the relevant facts, if you do not indeed focus on the relevant facts and act accordingly. So you need an ethics, and for that matter a philosophy, that direct your attention to reality, which is why focusing on reality will be the subject of Webinar 2. And as it turns out, I myself have missed some very relevant facts of reality, and misestimated the length of this webinar by a factor of 100%. And we are already about half an hour into the webinar instead of an hour, ready for Q&A. So I hope you have found what I have said interesting. I have put up my email address and a URL where you can go for more webinars, and in the not too distant future a recording of this one, so you can watch it twice if you really want to spend an hour watching it. So, Will, do we have any questions?
Just a second, Alexander. Well, Alexander, Bob Champion writes in just a commentary saying that he loved in her last in her last public appearance, Ayn Rand's answer to an audience question to the effect of, "What should we do to improve the lives of the homeless?" was, "Don't become one." That's a commentary for you from Bob Champion.
Yeah, well, there's something. I mean, my personal favorite story on that, that reminds me of, is the one where I think it was Rand was actually quoting somebody else, may have been Barbara Brandon, when she said, Will looks like he's nodding, maybe he recognizes the story and is confirming. And somebody said, who'll take care of the janitors? And the answer was, the janitors will take care of the janitors. This is an important fact about the objectivist approach, that we expect people to be competent, to be able to do things. We expect that not only is your life your highest value, but the other person's life is his. We expect that human beings are capable of taking efficacious actions. It is really supposed to be, and I hope I've given you some sense of this flavor, a very positive and uplifting view, rather than the negative one as which it is often perceived.
Thanks, Alexander. As your MC, folks, I just want to tell you, you should be able to um, click the raise your hand thing if you would like to give a verbal question or ask a verbal question. And there's a lot of challenging ideas here, so I hope you all will continue to ask questions. We're getting some written in questions here, but if you do raise your hand, I'll call on you to speak your questions or discuss as you like.
And let me say, by the way, that this webinar is, in a way, a run-through for a webinar for a lecture that will be presented at the Atlas Summit. And so, if you have things that you think should be included, I mean, I actually dropped things out of this as I was preparing it that I'm now thinking maybe should have been in there. But anything, any questions you might ask could very well be valuable in the development of future iterations of this project, which, now, why should you do that? Well, because it comes back to you, either if you are in the audience at the summit, if you are looking at the website in the future and have the opportunity to look at the recording from the summit, or there may be a future iteration even beyond the summit. So please bring forward your questions and your comments.
All right, Jeff Kiviat has a question that I think is an interesting one. Let me just do a slight self-promotion. David Kelly and I have written a text on objectivism called The Logical Structure of Objectivism, and in a way this grew out of a project of David's to survey the ethics, and you can find it on our website in the Objectivism Research section, and the book surveys the whole philosophy, and in a way is a long argument for how you get from survival to flourishing. So you can read the conclusion and read about that. Now, Jeff Kiviat writes in with a question that gets to this. Jeff writes in saying, I believe that flourishing increases your chances of survival and it can be justified that way. Now, Alexander, are you saying that flourishing as a value can be justified in some other way, that is, other than increasing your chances of survival? What do you say to that?
First of all, I certainly do not deny that under normal circumstances, flourishing does increase your chances of survival. And of course, ethics is created for normal circumstances. Ayn Rand wrote a novel once about very abnormal circumstances, very bad circumstances, and what a heroic person might do in those circumstances. And the and the heroic character probably does not maximize her lifespan, and yet the novel is called We the Living. And we see elsewhere in Rand's fiction, there's a character who dies, and only on the day he dies discovers what it means to live. That's a character you may recognize from Atlas Shrugged. And he says, what would I do with my neck if I had to keep it by not sticking it out? Doing the thing that normally tends towards survival, doesn't always maximize your chances of survival, and sometimes you know that. Sometimes you know that you are exposing yourself to a very great risk of imminent death, and yet conclude that the thing to do is to take that risk. Now, you might say, well, you could expect that normal circumstances will reemerge. And if you damage your character too much trying to survive under the abnormal circumstances, you will no longer be able to live under the normal ones. You can't live to 50 years from now by dying tomorrow. You may not actually have reason to expect the reemergence of normal circumstances. You may have only a moderate grounds to hope that by doing whatever it is you're doing, you're going to reestablish normal circumstances or get yourself to them. And that's why I think it's important to say that living well, qualitatively well, according to the standards that naturally tend toward survival, is part of what it means to live, is part of that supreme value that is your life. And certainly there is disagreement about that among objectivists, and that is the great thing about open objectivism. We disagree about things, or one of the great things about it. So yes, I would say that while the content of flourishing, if it's to be objective, must be grounded in ends of human survival, sometimes the thing that is most likely to cause you to survive even to the next hour is not the thing that is most consistent with living as a human being. And and that is a dimension of life, and that is something to value even when it comes into conflict with survival.
Okay, thank you, Alexander. Gene Coffey writes in asking, how do you describe objectivism in specifically living for yourself to others in a way that helps them understand the concept and not leave them looking at you as being vain or some other negative perception? So how do you describe this idea of living for yourself so that others can understand it and not think of you simply as a narcissist?
Was my webinar that bad that you couldn't already tell me?
Oh, no, I think you've made a shift at that, Alexander. You can just say I've been trying to do exactly that.
Yeah. I mean, I have been trying to do that. But here are some things. If the question is meant rhetorically, one of the things I would point to is to say, that it's probably better not to put it in the first person. You'll notice I didn't just give a webinar about how I'm living for myself. I gave a webinar about how you should live for yourself. It's not a statement that everybody in the world ought to live for the sake of Alexander R. Cohen. No, I ought to live for my sake. You ought to live for your sake. And so on down the line. Each person lives for the sake of him or herself. That's the view. And it is important to emphasize that what I am talking about here is a universal ethical principle of living for yourself that each person needs to follow in his or her own life. It's also, I think, worth talking about, and over the course of this 5-lecture series, I will talk about the value that you find in relationships with others. And in particular, I would actually turn the implicit challenge here on the other side. You know, people like to say, wait, shouldn't you value other people for their own sake rather than just for what they can contribute to your life? And they think that there is some deficiency in an objectivist if he is not valuing them independently of the value that they can contribute to his life in some way. But I would turn that around. And I would ask this question. Suppose that you are in an important, loving relationship, whatever kind of love it might be, whether it's, you know, a close friend, a romantic partner, a parent, a child, what have you. And that person were to say to you, well, no, it doesn't make much difference in my life whether you live or die, whether you flourish or are miserable, whether you're happy or sad. None of that makes any difference to my life. I'll go on just the same. I'm doing things for your sake, just for your sake. I get nothing out of it. Would you feel loved and valued? Or would you say, wait a second, that's the deficiency? Not with the egoist, with the altruist.
That's a good point, Alexander. By the way, Jean wrote in just clarifying that, yes, it was a rhetorical sort of a question, but about the fact that it's not easy to have a discussion, particularly with those who've been raised to believe that they have to produce for the world and not for themselves. And so it's hard to explain the idea to them.
Thanks.
We've got several questions. Another question comes in from Mark Lewis, and Mark asks, says this: in your example, you chose the professional event over your cousin's wedding. Does Ayn Rand really suggest either or thinking? Is your cousin's wedding a value for you? How can you demonstrate your cousin's value to you and attend your business session?
Well, first of all, you do often have to make either or choices. It was not possible for me to attend both. They were on opposite sides of the country. Had they turned out to be in the same general area, then I might have been able to say, well, I can take just a couple of hours off, catch the ceremony and go back. And I might have been able to do that. But maybe even then I might not have. Maybe a very important lecture was going to be presented at the same time as the ceremony. Maybe I was scheduled to lecture at the same time as the ceremony in that alternate version of the story. You do have to make choices. You do have to give up some opportunities. Contradictions are impossible. You cannot be in two places at the same time. So, yes, you do have to make either or choices. Now, I'm sorry, what was the next part of that question?
No, it was just how would you? So this conflict happened, Alexander, and if I can interpret, Mark's question for him. Did you find a way to demonstrate to your cousin that nevertheless you valued her and you appreciated what her marriage meant?
Sure. I mean, when I had an opportunity, not that long thereafter, I paid her and her husband a visit in their home. I brought them a gift. I took some time out of the day, on the day of their wedding, to place a phone call to them. My father was actually able to attend the wedding, and we arranged for him, actually I didn't call him, he called me, I think, at such time as he was able to get a moment with my cousin so that I could congratulate her over the phone. And I had explained, as soon as the conflict came up, I explained both to my cousin and to her father, my uncle, look, this is one of the most important events of my year. Every year it's a professional event, so forth. And I'm going to look and see if I can figure out a way to make these both work, but I probably can't. And it turned out when I looked at it that no, there was no way to make the transportation work and attend the wedding without missing too much of the event. So I spoke to them, and I think I successfully navigated that on that side. But there's something else important to say here. That decision reflected a priority judgment, that my professional work and the professional relationships that were involved with that event were more important than the contribution it could make to the family relationship. And so even if there had been a price to pay on the family side, it would have been a price worth paying for the sake of the professional opportunity. And remember that I said that you need to value your relationships insofar as they contribute to your life, and that it's only worth investing in your relationships if they contribute to your life. If my cousin were the sort of person who would have said, what? You're going to miss my wedding to go to an important professional event? You're not going to give up the most important professional event of your year, or one of the most important events of your year, which is also an occasion that you greatly enjoy with important friends of yours? And you know what? I'll say what the event was. It was the Atlas Society Summer Seminar. So, if my cousin were somebody who would do that, who would say, well, you know what? I don't have a cousin anymore because you went to this event, I would say, well, then you are actually a burden and not a benefit in my life, and goodbye. And, I would be disappointed to discover that. But I can't control the kind of person that she is. Now, I'm very glad to say my cousin is a much better person than that. She is certainly not an objectivist, might not understand why this particular event really is such an important professional event, and was at the time, even though I was not at the time working for the Atlas Society. But she understands the concept of professional events and the importance of professional events as a class. And therefore, she was able to understand where I was coming from and not hold it against me. And in fact, as she put it, her line was something like, the wedding is one day, the marriage is for the rest of our lives, you can come to the marriage. That is to say, you can come visit us in our home. We can do things together later on. It's not like this is the only opportunity we'll ever have to be together, which makes sense. I mean, I'm a cousin. I was not exactly going to be the central figure with her in the wedding. That she would, she would probably, if I hadn't been there, if I had been there, she would probably have spent 2 minutes with me. It was not a great blot on her day that I'm not there.
I'll remark that I don't actually know why anyone attends weddings. The people getting married are quite absorbed themselves. I mean, it's their event, but no, you're there to show them that you care, and it's a lovely thing.
There is something to be said for that, actually. Maybe it would be good if instead of having a custom of going to weddings, we had a custom of making a celebratory visit sometime during the first year.
Yeah.
And then you got to celebrate the new marriage. The new couple got to celebrate their marriage with each of their friends and connections in turn, and the friends and connections got to get more value out of the experience, and so forth. And that might actually be a better idea.
Yeah. Well, we've got several more questions here. Let's see if we can get to them in turn. Marjorie Peters just writes in asking, I've been told that emotional reactions are automatic and can't be controlled, but don't emotions proceed from value judgments?
Yes. And the thing is to remember how they proceed from value judgments and in what sense they are automatic. Rand actually gives us the analogy of a computer that you have programmed and then it responds automatically. I think it's an excellent analogy because your value judgments that control your emotions are not value judgments that you are making cognitively at the time before you feel an emotion. So, for example, if somebody dear to me dies, I do not first sit down and think through, well, here is why such a bad thing for me and so forth. Here is what death is. Here is what this person meant to me. Here is what the opportunity to continue to have interactions with this person meant to me and so forth. No. That's not the process that goes on. Rather, I have in my subconscious, that is to say, colloquially in the back of my mind, in the part of my mind that I'm not really thinking through, I have all this information, a lot of which is value judgments that I've already made. And so I see I get the news and I immediately, automatically have an emotional response. Now, on the other hand, suppose that somebody I really, truly hate dies. Then I might have actually a positive emotional response. I will admit to that in only one case, Deng Xiaoping. Will finds this startling, but for me, in the context of my life, Deng Xiaoping had committed the first huge act of evil that I was conscious of in my lifetime. The Tiananmen Square massacre. And
well, let's not. Never mind. Go ahead. Go on about your emotions.
Will I think disputes my interpretation of Chinese history.
That's okay. That's okay. That's okay. Never mind.
And no doubt disputes it with greater evidence than I have. So
never mind. Go on about your feelings. So you felt a feeling of joy when you heard that he died.
So I felt a positive feeling on that occasion. Maybe tomorrow Will is going to give me a lecture on Chinese history, and after that I will. But based on the evaluation of him that I had at that time, this huge evildoer had died. The world is a somewhat better place without him. Now, were value judgments affecting my emotions, controlling my emotions in these cases? Yes. Were the emotions automatic? Yes. They were automatic in that they were based on the existing value judgments. They were not deliberate at that time. I did not sit around, when somebody I love dies, I don't sit around saying, I ought to be sad, therefore I will be sad. When somebody I hate dies, I don't sit around, I ought to be happy, therefore I will be happy. That is not how emotion works. Now, I might deliberately say, and because I feel this way, I will express it in this way. I might say, for example, when my, I might say, for example, wait, this person who just died who was dear to me was even more dear and much more central to this other person who's also important to me. Let me try not to show my emotions too much so I can focus on supporting the other person. That's an experience I've had. I'm sure a lot of other people have had the same kind of experience. But the emotional reaction, especially at first, is an automatic reaction based on the value judgments that you already have. Now, might you change it by reevaluating? Well, sure. Let me give you an example. You might feel on hearing that some person had died just a little bit sad, the kind of sadness that you might feel on the hearing of that any random person had died. And then you might read that person's obituary and suddenly actually feel really sad that you never got to meet that person. Because your value judgments have changed. But even then, it wouldn't be saying, gee, this person turns out to be a remarkable hero. Let me therefore feel sad. It would be coming to appreciate the person's value and then feeling an emotional response. Does that answer your question?
Well, Marcy will have to write in, and Marjorie will have to write in and say whether it did. When we have a webinar recording about the issue of emotions, so in which I dig into this issue a little more, if people are interested. Thomas Knapp writes in with one of several questions.
And there will be some more reference to the theme of emotions over the course of this series.
I feel wonderful about that.
I've got, I have a colleague challenging me on something that I said. Let's not replace one dogma with another.
That's okay. We're waiting to get clarification on that one, Alexander. So please hold on there. Thomas Knapp writes in saying, I'm interested in why so many seem to think Alex's message is nothing but a statement of selfishness, which of course it is in the rational self-interest way. But what they mean is the all for me, none for you selfishness without explaining how to implement that without force. Comment?
Comment is I'm not sure I followed the question.
Okay. Well, maybe Thomas can clarify that.
Will, can you just copy that question into the chat so that I can actually see the question? Or maybe I could follow it better if I read it.
I'm not. There are other questions, so if you're having trouble understanding this one, why don't we wait for Thomas to clarify it? And
okay.
see there. There's just other people deserve a chance to get their questions answered. Here's another question from Thomas. He writes in, he says, I know that Rand spoke of the philosophical poison that intellectuals injected into societies since at least Kant in the late 18th century. But he says, I still have trouble understanding how a bunch of, he says, 50-pound heads, I think this means intellectuals or pinheads. He says, I still have trouble understanding how a bunch of pinheads could have caused so many to be so unhappy and guilt-driven. Do you have a view on this?
A code of values tells you what's good for you and bad, and it tells you maybe accurately, maybe inaccurately. Now, suppose that you think that it is bad for you to do things that you, in fact, really need to do. Or suppose you think that it's bad even to be happy or to do things for the sake of your own happiness. A couple of things will follow from any such bad advice if you accept it. First of all, sometimes you will act on that bad advice. And you will go and you will do things that are in actual fact against your well-being. So, for example, if you believe that you ought to give 10% of your income to the church, even though you don't get any useful guidance or any income from your church, you may then go and give that 10% to the church. And it will make your life worse because you could have done something better with that money. So that's one category of ways in which it makes your life worse to accept that kind of guidance. And the other category is that sometimes you won't follow that guidance. And you will pursue what actually contributes to your well-being, what actually brings you joy. And when you do it, you will also be thinking, but wait, this is a bad thing. And so you will feel some pain from that. Remember that the standard of your emotions is what you subconsciously take to be good for you and bad. And therefore, if you take joy as bad for you, well, it will be impossible for you to have a state of non-contradictory joy because every time you feel joy, you'll be thinking, or well, you will be feeling, well, this joy itself is bad for me.
Thanks. And Mark Lewis suggests that you add the additional detail about the story of your cousin's wedding and your time conflict to the presentation when you give it again. I think that's a good idea. And says, nice answer. Tobias Hanskelly writes in saying, offering this comment that this is at the heart of the definition of selfishness, that we do not judge ourselves selfish for following our own values. Others judge us selfish because we did not do what they felt we should do.
And in particular, we didn't do what would contribute to their values more. Ever notice that? You don't usually hear somebody complain because you did something for your friend, namely them, instead of for a stranger. You hear the complaint when it's, when there's some additional benefit they could have gotten. So that said, I think people who accept that there is something wrong with being selfish do sometimes blame themselves and feel guilty for pursuing what they want, or opt not to pursue what they want for the reason that it would be selfish. So, for example, a person might say, I'm not going to take this professional risk and pursue the job I want. That would be selfish. I'm going to pursue the most stable, best paying job because this way I can support my spouse and children the way I can, even though I'd really rather have the job I want. I'd be happier in the job I want, and when I make that decision, the result is probably going to be that my spouse and kids are going to feel like a burden because they're why I'm in this job that I really don't like. I mean, I remember actually I once knew a man who was an environmental lawyer in big firm practice representing corporations. Now, as you may guess, I don't think that it's necessarily evil to work for a corporation. But this was a man who was really seriously dedicated, at least he thought he was, to environmentalism. What he really wanted to do was to work for environmental nonprofits. And that was what he had done. But he left that work to pursue something more lucrative for the benefit of his family. And I would guess that if you asked him whether he thought it would have been selfish to keep working in the environmental nonprofit, he would have said yes. And now, just to avoid any confusion, actually, no, I'm sorry. If I, how can I say this without creating more confusion? Let me just say that I am not meaning to endorse working for environmental nonprofits. That I am not meaning to suggest that he was being rational in having that as a value. Only that he did, in fact, place a value on that kind of work. Next question.
Sure. Ambika Podar writes in saying, while being selfish, meaning working towards your own happiness, you can still live a pleasant and interactive social life? How? And how can you make people understand that it doesn't mean any harm to them, but it certainly means good for yourself? So I think perhaps more details on if you were pursuing your own happiness, how could you live a pleasant and interactive social life?
First of all, I am perhaps not the world's best expert on this, but I'll give it a shot. If you actually value other people, that is to say, you appreciate the contribution that having those relationships makes to your own life, then you're going to invest in those relationships. I mean, let me put it to you by an analogy. I think it's pretty easy to understand that, that at least often when you go to work for an employer, your purpose in doing that is largely the money that your employer is paying you. You are going into that relationship even in a more ideological context. You're going into that relationship for the things that are coming to you from it, whether it be the opportunity to do the kind of work you want to do, to promote the kind of cause you want to promote, to all these things you're looking for things that you're getting out of the relationship. Now, if you want to make that relationship work, you make a pretty big commitment to doing good things for your employer in the context of that relationship. You spend a pretty good part of your day contributing to your employer's projects. And at least some of the time, in any job, you are going to do some things whose only value to you is that they are of value to your employer. And that they thereby contribute to your life by means of your relationship with your employer. Now take that and translate it into a setting where we're less used to talking about self-interest, the context of a friendship. If I value a friendship, then I'm going to be willing to make a serious investment in that friendship. I'm going to do things for the sake of my friends. So, for example, if a friend calls me up and is considering killing himself or herself and wants to talk, I have made a commitment that I will talk to that person that day. Somehow, some way I will make that work. That will become an extraordinarily high priority. Because it's a matter of saving my friend's life. And my friend is a great value to me. Is it necessarily the case that I'm going to enjoy that more than any alternative use of my time? No. I do put effort into social relationships. And I do get pleasure out of social relationships. And sometimes the times that I'm putting in the effort are not the same as the times that I'm getting the pleasure. But if I am not the sort of friend who is willing to interrupt other priorities to take care of a friend's needs, then I can't expect to build the kinds of friendships where I can count on that kind of help. And sometimes I need that. And so, I make that investment, and I make that investment fully expecting that there will be some sort of payoff involved. Now, I don't go through my friendships constantly with a ledger saying, whoops, I've put in 10% more than I've gotten, this friendship's over. But I do keep an eye on whether there's really value for me in that relationship. And the more value there is, the more I'm willing to work on it. And the more potential value there is. Because, sometimes you have to be the first one to make the investment.
Thanks, Alexander. Maylin Tan writes in with a series of questions. I'll read from all of them because I think they all relate to each other. In chronological order, they go like this. First one, does it even matter what another thinks, whether they think you're selfish or otherwise? It's all a matter of semantics, isn't it? And then Maylin went on to comment that it strikes me that many are asking permission, so to speak, to live their values, a sort of validation that what we're choosing to do is permissible. And my point is that as long as I do what I do, and as long as it doesn't intentionally harm any other, and I live my value, it means not doing, even if it means not doing the kind thing.
Okay. There are a number of issues entangled here. I think the first thing that we need to do is we need to distinguish ethics from politics. Remember that ethics is about living your life. The realm of things that are permissible according to an objectivist or libertarian political view, the realm of things, that is to say, that nobody has a right to force you to stop doing, is a whole lot broader than the realm of things that it is rational for you to do. If I were to decide to quit my job, climb into bed, and not get out of bed for any reason whatsoever until I just died of thirst lying there in my bed, I would not have harmed anybody. I would not have committed a rights violation for which somebody ought to come and put me in prison. Objectivist politics would have nothing to say about how I had done something terrible and something ought to be done about it. In fact, objectivist politics would say, if that's what I want to do, I have every right to do it. Let me go. Let me die in my bed. I'm doing it. Objectivist ethics will say something entirely different. And any ethics that goes beyond a libertarian politics is going to say some things that are much more demanding than what libertarian politics says. Whether it's objectivist ethics or to take something very, very different, evangelical Christian ethics. If you're then you're going to have ethical demands according to your ethical system that are very much more restrictive, and much more demanding than your politics authorizes the government to be. Ethics and politics are two related but very different fields. So, saying, well, it doesn't harm another. That may be enough to warrant saying, in fact, it is enough to warrant saying that the government ought not to stop me. But that's a long way from being enough to warrant saying this is the right thing for me to do. Now, when we're talking about an ethical debate, among people who grasp that distinction and aren't confusing ethics with politics, looking for a positive, looking for somebody's approval isn't about saying, do you think the government ought to get in my way? It's about saying, do you think I'm doing the right thing? You're looking for a moral judgment. And ethical discourse involves a lot of that. Now, as we'll see, independence is a virtue. You have to think for yourself. If somebody disagrees with my moral judgment, depending on how much respect I have for that person's judgment, depending on how well he knows the facts of the case, depending on whether he's applying the same standards and so forth, that may be a very good reason for me to look back at my reasoning and ask whether I'm getting it right. That is, to ask myself whether I'm getting it right. But ultimately, I ought to go by my own judgment. And certainly, if somebody says, you're selfish, and thereby condemns me in terms I do not share, I ought not to be dissuaded from my course of action. But, as we'll see, I think in Webinar 5, when I talk about visibility and friendship and so forth, seeing that do share my judgment does have value in it, even within a context where we understand that coercion is not on the table. And I realize that's been a bit rambling, but I hope it's helped.
Ambika Podar follows up. Thank you for answering the previous question, but just wondered, in this context, if you're doing harm to yourself, you're sending the wrong message, aren't you? Because Rand says, love yourself and reach your highest potential, don't perish. I believe that was your point, that
Yes,
if you're harming yourself.
That's in the ethics. If I am harming myself, the government has no right to intervene just on account of my harm to myself. But some moral critic is, following objectivism, will certainly say that I am doing the wrong thing. Or at least that if I have, if I am valuing life, then I am acting contrary to the values, to that value. That I am acting contrary to morality. If I am not valuing life, if I have genuinely made that decision, then another person might very well say, well, it's bad for me that you're dying, if that's a person who in some way was getting value from me. I have various friends and colleagues and so forth who I hope would miss me if I did that. But if I'm actually not choosing to live, there's no opportunity there to morally pound on the table and go, you're doing the wrong thing.
Thank you, Alexander. we may be getting to our last question. Thomas Knapp wrote back in clarifying his question from a while ago that we had some trouble understanding. He says, sorry for the confusion regarding my first question. And he wants to know, what would you make, how would you make tonight's argument to, for example, President Obama, and respond to what I imagine might be one of the president's objections, to wit, what's wrong with from each according to his ability, to each according to his need?
You know, I've often said that of all the presidents in my lifetime, Barack Obama is the one I most wish were my next-door neighbor, because he really does seem like the kind of person who would enjoy having this argument. And if we lived next door to me, we'd probably become pretty good pals, arguing back and forth. You know, we're both the sort of people who enjoy arguing with people who disagree with us. And you know, the best part, of course, would be that if he were living in the apartment next to mine, he wouldn't be living, you know, down at 1600 Pennsylvania. So, yeah, what would I say if I were trying to convince if I were trying to convince President Obama of this? Well, I think to fully make out the case, I'd have to go through a lot of ethics, but here are some things I might say. I think President Obama genuinely wants people to be happy in their lives. You may think I'm naive for thinking this. I think it. I think he genuinely values helping people. And what I would say is, if you take away from people the conviction that they should pursue their own happiness, if you take away from them the ability to value their own life and their own happiness, if you take away from them being independent valuers, who's left to help? What is left there for you to be benevolent towards? What sort of happiness are you enabling them to achieve? What is wrong with from each according to his ability to each according to his need? Well, first, that slogan is a political proposal. But if you were to adopt a moral standard, if you were to say, the goal of my life is to benefit everybody to the best of my ability, and with no favoritism toward myself or to those close to me, then even if it turns out that your needs are actually met by others in terms of things like food and water and shelter and so forth, you're not getting the experience of living in the sense of sustaining your life from one moment and one day to the next. You're not getting the value of your choice of career. You're not getting the value of your chosen personal relationships. What kind of friend am I if I decide, hey, I've got a friend in the hospital, but hey, I could spend my time helping, a dozen strangers whom I've never met before, never will again. I'm going to help a dozen strangers because it's to each according to his need. What's left of me by that standard? Not much me.
Well, thank you, Alexander. I think that was our last question, except for the following question. Would you speak to the question of what would one get personally from returning next Monday and continuing on through May 20th with the remaining lectures? Came in through the chat.
If you come back next Monday, you'll get to hear about objectivist metaphysics and epistemology. You'll get to learn about why we, what it means to say things like existence exists, why you should say such things, why you should think such things, why we need to focus on reality in greater depth than I addressed it tonight, what it means to go about doing it. And if you then go and apply that, you may be able to think more clearly about things and solve problems in your life better. If you come back the week after that for values and virtues, you'll get a tour of the objectivist moral system and substantive ethics. The 7 virtues that Rand laid out, the 8th that David Kelly added. And that is real practical guidance for surviving, flourishing, and being happy. We come back the week after that, you'll hear about the distinctive objectivist case for individual rights. How does everything I said tonight and everything I'm going to say in the next two lectures integrate with a political view? Why is it that if the government can figure out what's good for me, it doesn't follow that it should regulate every inch of my life? What is the cost? What is the drawback of something like a Bloomberg soda ban? After all, probably would have made people healthier to drink less soda. How is it that smoking bans, indoor smoking bans, make people's lives worse? Surely people's lives would be better and certainly and longer if they didn't smoke. At least the evidence seems pretty clear to me. Somebody I highly respect seems to have a different opinion. And spiritual fuel. In that webinar, we'll actually be talking about a set of related issues that some people would think are contrary to the ideas I presented tonight. We have a philosophy here that is based on focusing on reality, and I am going to talk about the value of fiction and art. We have a system that is focused on living your own life for your own sake, and I am going to talk about the value of friendship. So you may be better able to appraise art and to appreciate the value of social relationships by means of what you learn in those webinars. And of course, one thing I hope that you will get, even if you already know a lot of these objectivist arguments, is a better sense of how they fit together into one coherent whole. This is a project for me to try to do for myself and also for you. Some of the integration of the whole system. So I think those are some of the things that I hope you will get if you attend these webinars. And I hope you will do that. But for your own sake, not for mine.